Last time we spoke about Day 2 of Operation Barbarossa. On the campaign's second day, Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leber, aimed to seize Leningrad and prevent Soviet retreats. Initial assaults caught Soviet troops off guard, leading to devastating German victories. However, logistical challenges in harsh terrain began to hamper their advance. As Germany celebrated these wins, Soviet forces regrouped and mounted fierce counterattacks, demonstrating unexpected resilience amidst all the chaos. In Finland, leveraging the situation, local activists orchestrated a rebellion in Kaunas, declaring independence and collaborating with German troops, marking a brief surge of hope amongst their people. Yet the brutality of war soon took center stage as Nazi units began committing horrific atrocities against Jewish communities. Amidst these grim realities, soldiers faced not only the daunting battles but also the moral implications of their actions. The tide of war began to reveal the brutal consequences of conflict, foreshadowing a dark period in history as both sides grappled with the unfolding horrors of the human suffering on the Eastern Front. This episode is Day 3 of Operation Barbarossa, the first Encirclement. Well, hello there and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over there, I just released a humorous episode looking at Call of Duty World at War, or World at War Crimes. Just a silly retrospective. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, about 26 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Well, hello again. We are now on Day 3 of Operation Barbarossa. Over the past two episodes, we covered Army Group Center and Army Group North as they made their initial thrust into the USSR. As the conflict unfolded, Army Group Center burst into the Soviet Union, fueled by unstoppable momentum. The thrust was bolstered by the most formidable deployment of the Luftwaffe assets ever seen on the Eastern Front. Imagine nearly 1,500 aircraft from the 2nd Air Fleet soaring through the skies, unleashing a relentless barrage on Soviet airfields, critical supply lines, and concentration of troops. At first glance, the initial air superiority seemed like a foregone conclusion. However, this early success of the Luftwaffe bellied deeper challenges lurking behind the surface. Reconnaissance gaps and a glaring lack of close air support were quietly starting to impede the operational effectiveness of the German forces on the ground. As the campaign roared into action, German troops led by Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group and Guderin's 2nd Panzer Group initiated a swift coordinated advance. Their goal? To encircle entire Soviet armies. Key locations like Altios and Grodno became battlegrounds where fierce tank clashes unfolded. Here the Germans encountered the formidable T-34s of the Red Army, a new and powerful adversary. Despite their bravery, disorganization and a failure to integrate combined arms tactics ultimately doomed the Soviet counterattacks. But today in this podcast, we're going to be continuing their story, and we're going to set the stage for one of the most significant encirclements in modern military history, at the Bialystok-Minsk pocket. So we're now venturing back to the campaign led by Army Group Center, who are currently being supported by two air corps, the 2nd Air Corps, under General of Aviation Ladza, the 8th Air Corps under Colonel General Richthofen, both of which were part of the 2nd Air Fleet under Field Marshal Kesselring. The 8th Air Corps was tasked with supporting the 9th Army, especially the Armored Group 3, while the 2nd Air Corps coordinated with the 4th Army, focusing primarily on Armored Group 2. The previous successes of the Wehrmacht's land campaigns had showcased the enormous advantage Germany gained through effective combined arms operations. Recognizing this critical synergy, Kesselring made it clear to his generals that the desires and strategies of the army were to be regarded at his own commands. This instruction underscored the necessity of collaboration, an essential element in the execution of their military plans. The commitment of air units in this campaign underscored the importance of Army Group Center as the spearhead of Operation Barbarossa. Around 1,500 planes took to the skies under the banner of the Second Air Fleet, boasting a formidable mix of modern light bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. In this crucial first week, these aircraft unleashed a series of raids on Soviet airfields and supply dumps, all in an effort to disrupt the Red Army's ability to respond effectively to the invasion. By the end of this initial phase, it was clear the Luftwaffe had overwhelmingly triumphed in the opening shots of the air war. Yet even in this promising start, serious challenges began to emerge. Despite the impressive number of aircraft, there was never enough close air support available to adequately assist the frontline troops. Gaps in air reconnaissance quickly became an issue. This lack of information allowed Soviet troop concentrations to go unnoticed, resulting in missed opportunities and surprise counterattacks. This failure to gather intelligence left the Corps and the Army commanders with an incomplete tactical picture. However, amidst these challenges, there was also significant successes for the close air support units of the air fleet. Throughout this tumultuous beginning, the sky remained a battleground of innovation and conflict, where both sides wrestled for dominance as the war unfolded. Some of the reasons for this was because the 8th Air Corps had been heavily involved in the capture of Crete, and with the battle concluding only in early July, there was barely enough time to prepare for Barbarossa. By June the 21st, the 8th Air Corps was critically short on resources. Approximately 600 motor vehicles, 40% of its aircraft, and essential communications equipment was all lacking. This significant shortfall loomed large just days before the invasion. On that same day, Colonel General Wilhelm von Richthofen, the commander of the 8th Air Corps, expressed deep concerns. "We are greatly concerned that our units are not yet ready." Maintaining hundreds of aircraft at peak operational readiness proved to be a constant technical challenge, obscuring the stark difference between the total number of aircraft and those truly combat-ready. For example, out of 425 dive bombers, only 323 were actually fit for combat, and of the 98 destroyers, merely 60 were operational. Amongst the 384 fighters, just 284 were combat-ready, while the total bomber force of 299 aircraft saw only 222 remain serviceable. Overall, while Air Fleet 2 boasted a total of 1,367 aircraft across all the types, only 994 were capable of executing combat operations. And this issue wasn't just limited to Air Fleet 2. Throughout the whole Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe faced an average 25% fallout rate amongst its aircraft. Consequently, a combined strength of nearly 3,000 aircraft translated into just 2,255 that was truly combat-ready. By the summer of 1941, it became increasingly evident that the Luftwaffe would only be able to fulfill its commitments if the war in the East could be won swiftly and with minimal losses. Practical concerns such as oil availability and strategic considerations regarding Britain made a prolonged campaign simply unattainable. The Luftwaffe was already stretched thin across multiple fronts, with approximately 1,566 aircraft tied down in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and within Germany itself. This significant dispersion of strength across less critical theaters hindered their ability to concentrate on the most vital front lines, the one with the narrowest window for success. To be honest, a large part of why a lot of the resources weren't on hand was because of the North Africa campaign. And hey, if it's of interest to you, I have an entire 10-part series covering the entire North Africa campaign found over on the Pacific War channel at YouTube, or if you want just the audio experience, it's on Echoes of War. Now, the left flank of Army Group Center was firmly anchored by the 6th Corps within the Suwalki salient. These determined troops advanced in the northwestern direction towards Vilnius, aiming to seize control of the critical bridges at Artius on the Niemen River. In their path lay several divisions of the Red Army. However, the Soviet 11th Army, led by Lieutenant General Morozov, stretched thin across a wide front of over 170 kilometers, offering little resistance to the relentless march of the German panzers from the 3rd Panzer Group. It was no surprise then that in the early hours of the 3rd Panzer Group's surge eastward, forward units reported encountering, quote, "only very weak or no enemy contacts." Luftwaffe reconnaissance confirmed this, identifying just one enemy artillery battery in their path. By the end of the day, Hoth's Panzer Group had reached the Niemen River, seizing captured bridges at Olita and Markini. The penetration of the Soviet front was significant. Halder remarked that the Panzer Group had already gained the freedom of operational maneuver, but he also noted in his war diary, "Where the enemy appears, he fights tenaciously and courageously to the death. Defectors and those seeking to surrender were not reported from any positions. As a result, the struggle will be harder than those in Poland and the Western Campaign." The strategic importance of Altius was clear. It needed to be secured to maintain the momentum of the offensive. On June the 22nd, the Germans achieved a crucial victory with the capture of Altius. Under the command of Colonel General Hoff, the 3rd Panzer Group pushed forward with incredible speed, covering a distance of 65 kilometers from their starting point to the bridges at Altius in less than 10 hours. After quickly brushing aside a small NKVD border guard post on the outskirts of the town, the Panzers began to cross the Niemen River almost immediately. This rapid advance not only secured the vital crossing, but also set the stage for further operations deeper into Soviet territory. Over on the Soviet side, the invasion triggered nothing short of utter chaos, most strikingly evident in the Western Military District, which faced Army Group Center. Here, the command structure collapsed almost immediately due to a near total loss of communication at most levels of the chain of command. This complete disarray made it impossible to gather coherent information about the current situation, severely hampering the development and execution of coordinated Soviet responses. As internal confusion mounted alongside external pressure from the German advance, the Western Military District descended into disintegration. This slide towards chaos was exacerbated by the Soviet High Command's misguided adherence to pre-war plans, which called for immediate counterattacks. However, due to lack of proper preparation and direction for these efforts, they resulted in piecemeal assaults that proved ineffective while inflicting heavy casualties on the Soviet forces. To give an example, the 11th Army, operating under the command of the Soviet Northwestern Front, had begun to organize a counterattack against the 4th Panzer Group at Resinya. However, the situation was precarious. The 11th Army had only the 5th Tank Division available to respond to the Germans crossing at Altius. To complicate matters further, the Soviet tanks faced a 30-kilometer road march to reach their positions, causing a crucial delay that allowed the German panzers time to concentrate their forces. By the time the Soviet tanks were nearly in position, the panzers had managed to deploy an entire regiment ready to cross the Niemen River. Unfortunately for the Soviets, some of their tanks suffered mechanical issues and fell behind on the way. Nonetheless, they arrived in force with 44 T-34s, a mark of their most formidable capabilities. In the first encounter, the German troops were taken by surprise by the T-34s. The Soviet tanks swiftly targeted the northern of the two bridges, effectively shutting it down, and destroyed a PZ-38T on the site. However, the Soviet tanks faced a limitation of their own. They were short on armor-piercing ammunition. To minimize their exposure while still covering the bridge, they pulled back to a defile-like position, continuing to keep the panzers in check. On the scene, Colonel Rothenburg, the German commander, quickly called in Luftwaffe support. The Air Force arrived shortly, unleashing high-explosive bombs on and around the Soviet positions in the northern sector. Now, just prior to this, the T-34s had received reinforcements in the form of additional T-28 medium tanks. Together, they had formed a defensive line that kept the Germans just out of range of the Panzer's light armament. While this confrontation unfolded at the northern bridge, more panzers began crossing the southern bridge, only to encounter BT-7 tanks waiting to engage them. A minor stalemate developed in both sectors, but the Soviets quickly began to show signs of weakness. Unlike their German counterparts, they lacked the staying power needed to hold their ground under pressure. As evening fell, it became evident that the Soviets' failure to provide adequate support for their tanks was detrimental. They struggled without sufficient infantry, artillery, and air support to bolster their defenses. Finally, the Germans managed to break through, regaining momentum and resuming their drive forward. The next morning, the Soviet 5th Tank Division withdrew, having suffered substantial losses, approximately 70 tanks in total. This included at least 27 of the modern T-34s, which were in short supply during the early days of the war. Tragically, many of these tanks were lost due to operational error. 2 of them accidentally drove into the river, resulting in complete losses. The Germans, on the other hand, incurred losses of around 30 tanks, though only 11 of these were total losses. Significantly, all the Soviet losses were irrecoverable, a stark contrast to the German experience. Several factors contributed to this discrepancy, but the most apparent was the chaotic nature of the Soviet retreat. The Soviets often fell back in disarray, which hindered their ability to recover and salvage their own equipment. Even if they had been more organized, it remains questionable how well equipped the Soviet tank divisions were with recovery equipment. The tables of organization of the Soviet Tank Division in 1941 authorized 1 crane truck and 20 recovery tractors. Most sources do not cover the status of this type of auxiliary equipment, but considering what we do know about the poor state of the authorized tank strengths, it seems unlikely that any division had proper recovery vehicles in place during the first days and weeks of the war. In the early weeks of the war, the Germans clearly excelled in this critical aspect of military operations, allowing them to maintain their momentum while the Soviets struggled to regroup. Whatever delays and casualties these early Soviet counterattacks caused the German forces, the horrendous losses on the Soviet side often led literature to portray it as a one-sided conflict that favored the narrative of an unrelenting German blitzkrieg. This focus tends to obscure an important reality. From the earliest stages of the war, German losses were far from negligible. Typically, German casualties did not stem from large-scale battles in conventional engagements with the Red Army. Instead, they were primarily the result of disintegration of organized Soviet fighting formations. The breakdown in command and the control led to numerous smaller skirmishes that, while not really significant on their own, collectively inflicted a substantial toll on the invading forces. Just on the third day of the conflict, Halde noted that the casualties were, quote, bearable, but remarkably high losses amongst the officers. During said period, Soviet tactics, though quite crude, proved effective. Engagements were often initiated by small groups of Soviet soldiers who would ambush unsuspecting German forces from carefully selected positions. This approach leveled the playing field against the German superiority in heavy weapons, mobility, and air power. The dense Belarusian forests and high summer cornfields provided excellent cover for these Soviet troops, allowing them to prepare ambushes along the roads essential to the German advance. As German columns stretched longer across the countryside, gaps inevitably opened between the fast-moving panzers and the slower infantry. This left poorly defended supply columns exposed to attacks, even from small groups of soldiers without heavy weaponry. This situation sparked an immediate and effective form of guerrilla resistance, executed by soldiers armed with military-issued equipment rather than just some untrained peasants. By June the 24th, the 3rd Panzer Group reported that the forests were teeming with fugitive Soviet soldiers who were, quote, attacking from the flank and the rear, causing unrest and slowing the advance. Therefore, a request was made for the reserves from Colonel General Adolf Strauss's 9th Army to be dispatched so that they could clean out the woods. However, the vast area in question made this an impossible task, especially given the limited German reserves. In fact, at no point in the war did German security forces succeed in eliminating partisan resistance in Belarus. Quite on the contrary, these forces only grew in number and effectiveness. A similar pattern of attacks plagued the 2nd Panzer Group's rear area from the outset of the war. A former officer from the 3rd Panzer Division would say, during the first 2 days of combat, unarmored troops and rear echelons suffered considerable losses inflicted by hostile enemy troops cut off from their main bodies. They hid beside the march routes, opened fire by surprise, and could only be defeated in intense hand-to-hand combat. German troops had not previously experienced this type of war. Now, just due south of Altius's area lay Bialystok salient, a broad protrusion of the Soviet lines extending into the German-controlled parts of Poland. The salient was flanked by German forces on both of its northern and southern sides, stretching approximately 250 kilometers at its widest point. The fortress of Brest anchored in the southern end of the front along the Bug River. This acted as a dividing line between the Soviet northwestern and western fronts, which would run just south of Altius, creating a distinct advantage for Hoth's panzers as he operated along this divided area of responsibility. The bulk of the opposing western front forces remained concentrated within the Bialystok salient. Although the utter disarray engulfing the Soviet western front positioned most of their counter-moves for failure, the impact of the Red Army's new tanks was evident even in the most one-sided encounters. In an attempt to cut off the German penetration and seal the dangerous breach in the Soviet front, Lieutenant General Dmitry Pavilov, the commander of the Western Front, launched frantic counterattacks on June the 24th and the 25th against the left wing of Army Group Center. He did so using his 11th and 6th Mechanized Corps. The 11th Mechanized Corps was comparatively weak, equipped with only 60 T-34s and KV-1s, supported by 200 older T-26s and BT series tanks. In contrast, the 6th Mechanized Corps fielded 960 tanks, with approximately half being the newer medium and heavy T-34 and KV-1 designs. Unfortunately, plagued by communication issues and a lack of precise intelligence, the Soviet offensive was hopelessly ill-coordinated. As a result, it missed its intended target, Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group, and instead collided with the 20th and 8th Army Corps of the advancing 9th Army. Even before making contact, the counterattack directed by Pavlov's skilled operations officer, Lieutenant General Ivan Boldin, was severely hindered by relentless aerial assaults led by Colonel General Wolfram von Richthofen's 8th Air Corps. Boldin's scattered forces endured heavy losses even trying to reach their designated assembly areas in the Luna, Indura, Skolka region south of Grodno. His long armored convoys became easy targets for the formidable Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, which in some cases were equipped with phosphorus bombs. Complicating matters further, the T-34s and KV-1s had only recently been introduced to the two mechanized corps, arriving in April and May of 1941. Many KV-1s still lacked ammunition, and the crews for the new models were assigned only in late May and early June, leaving very little training. As a result, Bodin's counterstroke was merely a shadow of its intended strength. Nevertheless, the sight of massed Soviet tanks, particularly the newer T-34s and KV-1s, instilled some panic amongst the German Panzerjäger anti-tank units as they watched round after round bounce off the Soviet armor. Urgent requests for more armor-piercing shells was sent out, while Richthofen squadrons provided critical close-air support. The near-total absence of aerial cover cost the Soviets dearly, and the offensive soon devolved into another catastrophic defeat with heavy losses. However, two significant factors emerged from this engagement. First, the battle delayed the advance of the Ninth Army's right wing and widened the gap between the 3rd Panzer Group and its infantry support. More importantly, this confrontation exposed the vulnerability of German units to attacks by the latest Soviet tank models, which, with Soviet factories now working at a very furious pace, posed a dire threat to the Germans if the war dragged on beyond its expected time frame. A report given by junior Soviet officer Lieutenant Pavel Guds, commanding 5 KV-1s and 2 T-34s on the southern front during the war's first day, captures the scene vividly. The Germans started bombing the column. A shell from a German anti-tank gun bounced off the tank's heavy armor. I was both the tank's gunner and commander. I fired a single shot in return, destroying the enemy gun. Then me and my platoon, we went out to knock out 5 German tanks, 3 armored personnel carriers, and several cars. After lunch, the Germans attacked again, and I disabled 3 more tanks. My driver, Galkin, rammed another German tank, dislodging its track and forcing it to ditch. The fields were covered with burned-out tanks and dead Germans. On June the 25th, elements of the 57th Panzer Corps, under General of the Panzers Kunzen, captured Vilnius, while the 39th Panzer Corps, under General of the Panzers Schmidt, began advancing towards Minsk. They executed a wide flanking maneuver behind the Soviet Third Army, effectively trapping them in the early stages of what would become known as the Bialystok-Minsk Encirclement. Despite his firm belief that Army Group Center's top priority should be the closure of the encirclement at Minsk, Halde favored sending elements of both panzer groups towards the Dvina and Dnieper rivers to secure bridgeheads for the next stage of the advance. On June the 29th, Halde recorded in his diary for the first time his objective for the Army Group Center, and that was the attack on Moscow. He expressed hope for the seizure of Rokachev and Mogilev along the Dnieper, stating that this would, quote, open the road to Smolensk, and from there, the course to Moscow. Meanwhile, at Hitler's headquarters, a very different picture was emerging. Hitler was also considering the continuation of the campaign following the elimination of the pocket. The critical question was whether the main thrust of operations should be directed towards Moscow or Leningrad. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch of the OKH was known to be in attendance at the Wolfslair on June the 29th, and while the records do not specify, he likely recommended that they should hit Moscow. Even if he did not, he certainly would have supported it. However, Hitler was more inclined to focus on cutting the Soviets off from the Baltic Sea, thereby denying them access to the North Sea. This strategy would secure Germany's ore transports from Scandinavia and allow for the concentration of Finland's strength for their attack in the east. Regarding an eventual thrust on Moscow, Hitler argued that an advance on Leningrad would secure the left flank of the later operation, and that for the time being, the Soviet capital should simply be subjected to bombing. The following day, on June the 30th, Hitler expanded on these sentiments, asserting that the addition of panzer forces from Army Group Center would facilitate the rapid seizure of Leningrad's industrial area, and that only after this should they attack Moscow. In more immediate concerns, Brauchitsch reported that Hitler was once again expressing nervous anxiety about the depth of Schweppenberg's 24th Panzer Corps, which had just reached Bobryansk and was building a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Brezina River on June the 29th. Brauchitsch reassured Hitler that this was simply flank protection for the main operation at Minsk. However, Halder, who was not present but later received a report from Brauchitsch, recognized that Guderin would settle for nothing less than the quickest possible crossing of the Dnieper. Halder personally supported Guderin in this endeavor, yet Hitler remained concerned that the 24th Panzer Corps had overextended itself. He forbade Army Command from issuing any further orders for the eastward advance of the Panzer Corps, effectively tying Halder's hands. Halder regarded this as a grave mistake, but was unwilling to concede command of the campaign to Hitler. In his diary, Halder defiantly stated, Let us hope that the middle levels of command will do the right thing on their own, and without express orders, which we cannot issue because of the Führer's orders to Blauisch. A strict interpretation of his orders prohibited him from issuing any command to advance, but it did not explicitly require him to forbid action if it was undertaken independently by the generals themselves, which he assumed it would be. Using this tenuous reasoning, Halder convinced himself that he could still achieve his objectives without disobeying orders. While Germany's leading generals clashed amongst themselves, and with Hitler's headquarters over direction for the Eastern Campaign, infighting amongst Germany's political institutions was even more intense. Headed by some of the most unscrupulous personalities of the Third Reich, notably Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, each man vied for the largest slice of the lucrative Soviet pie, seeking to expand the respective empires within the internal authorities of the Nazi state. Observing this chaotic scene, Goebbels, who himself was embroiled in a dispute with the OKW and the designated minister for the New Eastern Territories, Alfred Rosenberg, over the dissemination of propaganda, complained in his diary, "Always the same thing, spheres of authority. If we go down, it will be as a result of these disputes." Earlier during the afternoon of June the 22nd, German assault guns from the 8th Infantry Division took Grodno. As they advanced, they encountered the 29th Tank Division. Unfortunately for the Red Army, the local commander, Colonel Stednev, was not amongst the most competent of the leaders. Mistaking the assault guns for panzers, he decided to engage from a distance. His poorly trained gunners wasted their ammunition with ineffective shots. Recognizing that their assault guns were unlikely to achieve significant results, the Germans took cover and called in air support. Stuka dive bombers swiftly arrived and began attacking the stationary Soviet tanks. Meanwhile, the 8th Infantry Division engaged with their artillery, proving effective in destroying several light tanks. After enduring 4 hours of this combined arms assault, Stednev's men retreated, having lost 33 tanks while inflicting only a couple dozen casualties on the invaders. Importantly, this delay did not significantly hinder the Germans. In fact, the panzers were never even present in the area. They were busy pushing east and north at breakneck speed, seeking to envelop the very units that were so eagerly rushing to the border within the growing pocket. On the southern half of the developing encirclement was the 2nd Panzer Group under Colonel General Guderin. His group represented the largest concentration of armored forces assembled in the short history of the Wehrmacht. Guderin was a prima donna by reputation, even at this early stage of the war. However, he was a daring commander who never hesitated to argue with his higher command. He schemed to increase his responsibility and resources. In the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa, Guderin's Panzer Group faced one of the longest marches to its objective, that being Minsk, situated over 400 kilometers from the starting point. For comparison, the march of the 3rd Panzer Group was notably shorter at 300 kilometers. It was also anticipated that Guderin's route would encounter some of the stiffest enemy resistance. The first week yielded mixed results. The Brest fortress could not be overwhelmed and needed to be bypassed. Infantry units from Field Marshal Kluge's 4th Army were assigned to reduce it instead. Guderin's tanks faced Red Army units immediately upon crossing the Bug River on the morning of June the 22nd. The 14th Mechanized Corps launched a counterattack en masse, deploying over 200 tanks. However, nearly all of these were outdated light tanks from the previous decade. The newer and more advanced models, which were causing other German panzer units significant trouble elsewhere along the front, were conspicuously absent from Guderin's opposition. Several factors combined to give the panzers a decisive edge in the engagement. The T-34, KV-1, and KV-2 were still in limited production runs and would not make up the bulk of the Red Army's armor forces until much later on in the war. Exact dates are disputed, but it is likely that by late 1943, this generation of designs dominated the frontline armor units. Of course, on no side during the war was tank development static, and many submodels and evolutions of designs were admitted into the service. Some were better than others. They enjoyed tactical surprise, demonstrated superior organization, and had ready access to close air support, amongst other advantages. As a result, the Soviet counterattack was halted in its tracks, leading to severe losses before the Red Army. While the Germans did suffer some tank losses, the counterattack did not significantly hinder their progress. In the following days, Marshal Timoshenko, the commander of the entire field army, sought to galvanize the Western Front into utilizing its armor to counter the invading forces. He directed several armored units to retake Grodno, still unaware that no panzer units were present in the city. The 6th Mechanized Corps was ordered to march on Grodno and expel the Germans. The Luftwaffe's extensive commitment to Army Group Center once again proved effective, as aerial reconnaissance detected the approaching tank columns on the 23rd. This intelligence was promptly relayed to the 8th Flying Corps' headquarters, which dispatched aircraft to attack the advancing columns. Under the command of Colonel General Richthofen, the Luftwaffe destroyed 63 tanks, causing significant disruption of the Soviet march. By the way, Richthofen was the cousin of the infamous Red Baron of World War I, Captain Manfred von Richthofen. He was an ace in his own right, and he would go on to the highest levels of command in World War II. He was an ardent supporter of Hitler, and he accepted bribes and other extra-legal benefits in the dictator's service. He spent the last months of his life as an American POW before succumbing to a brain tumor in July of 1945. When the 6th Mechanized Corps arrived in the Grodno area, it was a formidable force, on paper, the strongest collection of armor in the Red Army. Under Major General Katskilevich, the Corps boasted at least 100 KV tanks, nearly 200 T-34s, and hundreds of light tanks. However, there were significant logistical challenges. The light tanks required gasoline, while the medium and heavy tanks operated on diesel. This discrepancy meant that logistics would need to cover two types of fuel, with stocks depleting at uneven rates. Unfortunately for Katskilevich, the closest major supply depot in Bialystok had been destroyed, forcing him to rely on the next supply source in Vavkivsk, located 65 kilometers to the rear. Recognizing the urgency, he sent whatever resources he could back to retrieve more fuel supplies. For the moment, the 6th Mechanized Corps found itself hindered by this fuel shortage. Additionally, the lack of radios and other communication equipment made it impossible to coordinate any action with the 11th Mechanized Corps. As a result, while the previously mentioned 29th Tank Division was enduring a devastating assault, Katskilevich was unable to provide any assistance. Only on the 24th did Katskilevich order an assault. Due to the ongoing diesel shortage, he could only deploy his light tanks, which were poorly positioned and ran directly into prepared anti-tank defenses. The attack was repulsed. On the 25th, he attempted again, this time incorporating his medium and heavy tanks. However, success remained elusive. There was essentially little to no effective combination of artillery, infantry, and air support with the tanks. Unlike the coordinated assaults the Germans had consistently demonstrated in the early days of the campaign. Consequently, any localized moments of success were swiftly crushed by the Wehrmacht's combined arms approach, as the beleaguered Soviet tanks attacked in waves of increasing desperation. While the Soviet heavy tanks proved daunting for the Germans to handle, they too suffered from inept crews and poor coordination. Eventually, these tanks were either abandoned or destroyed by close-range heavy anti-tank fire. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that the Western Front headquarters realized that they were squandering their armor. The Wehrmacht had not concentrated its armor at Grodno, but had instead positioned it on the flanks of its salient. In horror, Pavlov recognized this too late and ordered the remnants of the 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps to pull back to cover Slonim to prevent Guderin from cutting off their main line of retreat. Unfortunately, this retreat did not go well. It effectively broke the units, leaving them as little more than disorganized mobs. The 17th Panzer Division arrived at Slonim late on the 24th, only to find the bridge had been blown up. They quickly deployed pioneers to build a new bridge across the Shatsa River that very night. Meanwhile, the rest of the 47th Panzer Corps caught up and pushed through Beranavice. The Bialystok pocket was now all but closed. Although Guderin's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group still needed to reach Minsk, there was now little standing in their way. The 12th and 20th Panzer Divisions reached the outskirts of Minsk on June the 26th. Contact finally established between Hoth and Guderin at Minsk, ostensibly closing the outer ring of the encirclement. However, in practice, the southeast side was far from being sealed. At Army Group Center, Field Marshal Friedrich Werder von Bock was anxious to advance towards the Great Rivers, but he was dismayed by the lost opportunities caused by Higher Command's insistence on focusing on the Bialystok-Minsk pocket. Venting his frustration, he would write in his diary, "That is the curse of an evil deed. If we turn near Minsk, there will inevitably be a stop there until the entire Bialystok-Minsk pocket has largely been cleared. I wanted to take possession of the Dnieper, or at the very least the Berezanino bridges, quickly, so as to not have to fight for them later on, which unfortunately will now be the case." They began their assault the following day. The city was encircled by a ring of bunkers and fortifications, but these defenses were not manned with the full strength necessary for a proper hold. Minsk marked the easternmost point of the encirclement and had trapped the better part of the three Soviet armies, those being the 3rd, 10th, and 13th armies. These forces were loosely arranged in an oval stretching from Naberhudak in the west to Minsk in the east. The last major independent unit of the Western Front was the 4th Army, commanded by Major General Korobkov. He narrowly escaped encirclement along with his comrades near Minsk, primarily because Guderin's panzers had split him from the rest south of Berenovici. While the Fourth Army lived to fight another day, it suffered significant losses inside the pocket. As Hoth's panzers assaulted Minsk, the fortifications continued to hold them back, resulting in casualties. The recent rainfall had turned the ground to a mud, severely limiting their maneuverability as they fought through and around the city's outskirts. Meanwhile, Guderin's leading elements remained far from being able to seal the southern flank of the encirclement. The Luftwaffe relentlessly bombarded the city, causing widespread fires upon detonation. At one point, nearly half of Minsk was engulfed in flames, which made the defense of the city even more challenging. Finally, on the 28th, the heart of Minsk was occupied by elements of the 12th Panzer Division. However, Guderin was still unable to close his end of the encirclement. It wasn't until well after the fall of Minsk that his forces linked up with Hoth's. By June the 29th, the encirclement was officially sealed, but there was just enough time for several units of the 13th Army to slip through the gap. However, Guderin was blind to such problems, and his post-war memoirs glossed over the incomplete nature of the encirclement, seeking instead to celebrate his great achievements at Minsk as an outstanding success. Reflecting on the final days of June, Guderin would write, "The Russian forces, which had been in Bialystok's area, had been attempting in vain to break through our encircling pincers. They were now completely surrounded. The foundations had been laid for the first of the great victories of the campaign." The confident tone of these reflections hid a more genuine picture of the fighting that Guderin had conveyed in a letter to his wife on June the 27th. After describing the initial days as, quote, strenuous, he mentioned the loss of several officers who had been close to him and the sadness it caused. When discussing the Red Army, he noted with a hint of grim resignation, "The enemy resists bravely and bitterly. The fighting, therefore, is very hard. One just has to put up with it." By nature, Guderin was not a pessimist. Indeed, he had previously been accused of viewing events through an overly optimistic lens. His letters simply conveyed the character of the new war in the East, which was marked by fervent hostility and fanaticism, unlike anything he had encountered before. By the end of June, a begrudging acknowledgement of the Red Army's unexpected zealous resistance was growing amongst the upper circles of the Wehrmacht and the Nazi Party. This reflected the stark contrast between the reality of war and the elevated confidence that had consumed the German leadership prior to the launch of the operations. For many, this realization was just beginning to take hold. While it would be too much to suggest that anyone doubted Germany's ultimate triumph, the shock of facing genuine resistance was palpable. On June the 29th, Goebbels noted in his diary, "The Russians are fighting bravely. Their command is functioning better than during the first few days." The following day, he remarked this, "In foreign countries, our military situation is, if anything, being judged rather too optimistically, even by our enemies. They think our Wehrmacht capable of the most amazing achievements." By July the 1st, despite general satisfaction with the developments, Goebbels conveyed a clear sense of unease. "The Russians are putting up more of a fight than one would have expected. Our losses in men and equipment are not completely insignificant." Similarly, Bock described the ongoing challenges of defeating the sizable Soviet armies, noting that the swift breakthroughs to Minsk had not fully achieved their goal. Unlike previous campaigns where surrounded enemy units acknowledged their defeat and just surrendered willingly, the Red Army was far more resistant. The implications for Operation Barbarossa were quite profound. Reviewing events to the rear area on June the 28th, Bock would observe, "Our losses are not inconsiderable. Thousands of Russian soldiers are hiding in the forests, far behind the front, some in civilian clothes. Catching them is all but impossible given the tremendous size of the area. 100 kilometers behind the front at Semyatsisk, the 293rd Division is still fighting for a row of strongly fortified bunkers, which had to be taken one at a time. In spite of the heaviest fire and the employment of every means, the crews refused to give up, each one having to be killed one at a time." Meanwhile, the infantry of the Army Group Center advanced and began the process of reducing the pocket, but this was no easy task. Even when Red Army units surrendered, the sheer size of the encirclement made it difficult to manage. Many soldiers continued to fight and die long after the Wehrmacht's generals had deemed the situation resolved. It would be several days before the pocket was officially declared liquidated. Fighting remained intense until the very end. This battle became known as the Bialystok-Minsk pocket. It marked the first major operational success of Operation Barbarossa and was one of the largest encirclements in modern military history, rivaled only by the Dunkirk pocket. The vast majority of the Western Front was either destroyed, encircled, or disintegrating as they retreated from the advancing Germans. In the aftermath of sealing the encirclement, Hitler intervened in the chain of command and ordered the panzers to halt their advance. This move echoed his earlier decisions during the lead-up to Dunkirk, driven by a similar fear. He was concerned that the panzers would leave the infantry behind, exposing their long and fragile logistical lines to a counterattack. Halder, in his role as Chief of Staff of the OKH, argued against this decision. He was nominally the man responsible for such strategic choices, and in previous wars he could have had the authority to proceed as he saw fit. However, Halder underestimated Hitler's resolve regarding the matter, a miscalculation he would continue to make throughout his tenure. Halder, at least externally, was a man of complex motivations. He was bribed by Hitler throughout his tenure. He was certainly aware of the racial motivations of the Nazi regime and was comfortable exercising command in an army engaged in a war of genocide as a matter of course. At the same time, he was sympathetic to the July 20th plotters and their attempted assassination of Hitler. Acquitted of war crimes after the war, he would go on to lay the groundwork behind the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Ultimately, the panzers were halted despite Halder's objections. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership was distraught but determined to continue the fight. Much of the Nazi leadership believed that the Soviet Union could not withstand such a severe blow, as they delivered at Minsk. They thought that they had kicked in the door and expected the entire rotten structure to crumble. They were mistaken. Stalin would not permit the Soviet Union to fall so easily. Timoshenko was appointed to lead the Western Front in Pavlov's stead, and he immediately set about organizing defenses in front of Smolensk. The enemy's objective was now clear. The panzers aimed to continue their advance along the Brest-Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow route. It was now Timoshenko's task to halt their progress. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget to check out our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I just released a rather silly episode covering who remembers Call of Duty World at War, or war crimes, that is. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Army Group Center advanced relentlessly, supported by a powerful Luftwaffe. Initial successes against poorly prepared Soviet troops gave rise to confidence, but logistical issues soon hampered German operations. As Soviet forces regrouped, fierce counterattacks emerged, revealing their resilience. The chaotic response from Soviet command only deepened their losses. Within days, the Germans encircled vast Soviet armies in the Bialystok-Minsk pocket, marking significant operational victory.